There's a lot that goes into crafting a story. Many interconnected elements, all coming together to form a single cohesive identity. Depending on the story, these elements might change, vary in importance, and may or may not be present at all. However, if you were to try and boil down a story to 3 fundamental building blocks, I think you'd end up with the same 3 components, regardless of context. Plot, character, and world. Plot, or the events that make up the story, what actually happens. Characters, who live through and act out these events, who we experience the story through. And world, the setting that the characters inhabit and where the events of the plot take place. Most, if not all, stories have these elements, and a great story excels at all 3. Compelling characters, living out an engaging plot, all set in a fascinating world. Well, actually, to say that a story needs to excel at all 3 is somewhat misleading. While yes, you can say that every story needs plot, character, and world to actually function, to say that a story needs to focus on all of them at once at the exact same level is just wrong. Sure, it can be done. An example that comes to mind is Fullmetal Alchemist, but it doesn't have to be, and in fact, may not even be necessary, depending on the themes and the type of tone the author is going for. These are driven stories, which basically min-max towards 1 or 2 of the story building blocks at the cost of the others. Plot-driven stories, or story-driven stories, which I won't be referring to them as, are stories that prioritize the plot over everything else. In these kinds of stories, the focus is on events that the world and characters react to, thus pushing the plot forward. They're tight, well-structured, and more often than not, packing 1 or 2 plot twists. These tend to be high-concept stories, ideas that can be easily pitched and summarized. Ergo, a lot of blockbusters tend to be plot-driven, though there are exceptions. Expect most mystery or action stories to be this. That isn't to say that plot-driven stories can't have complex character arcs or deep, well-thought-out worlds with lots of history. It's just that they aren't the focus. They aren't what drives the story forward. Any conflict that is had is mostly external, escaping a plane full of snakes, taking the ring to Mordor, or beating the Fire Nation. It's possible for character conflict to arise from these situations, but again, they aren't the focus that drives the story forward, which leads us to character-driven works are stories that place their focus on the characters more than anything. In these kinds of stories, the plot is driven by the choices that the characters make. These choices could be the result of an initial event, or from the characters themselves. Either way, they are, in a sense, what forms the actual plot over time. The cast of characters that we focus on are highly developed, with dynamic character arcs. Group interplay is something that becomes very important, especially if there's a particularly large ensemble of characters. But it's not uncommon for the focus to be on just a few main characters in order to explore their development in great detail. This kind of approach is more common in serialized or episodic fiction, and genres that often make use of it include comedies and certain types of thriller. Bear in mind, just because I'm categorizing stories into plot and character-driven, don't get the impression that these are rigid labels that every story must fall under. Plenty of them fuse together to create unique story dynamics, and one can even change completely over time. A plot-driven story might place a greater focus on its characters and their internal struggles the longer it goes on, or vice versa. An initially character-driven story might introduce an external conflict that the characters must react to, becoming more plot-focused in the process. You might have noticed that I've been excluding one of the big 3 elements I introduced at the start of this video. This final type of story, at least by itself, is the least common, but to me at least, is a kind of story that, if pulled off right, creates a type of atmosphere and feeling that is impossible to replicate with any other. World-driven stories, as the name suggests, are stories driven not by specific events or character actions, but by setting. This can include the actual physical world itself, its history, its people and culture, even politics, depending on how it's handled. The world itself acts as a premier force guiding the narrative, and this can be done in a variety of ways. Perhaps the most easily effective is just to simply not tell us anything about the world, make its nature a mystery, if not to the characters, then to the viewers, enticing us to learn more about it, making it something to be discovered, turning these stories into something of an archaeological dig. This is the approach used by the manga and anime Made in Abyss, which, while also being a very character-driven series, has its premise, characters, and plot all revolve around exploring the titular abyss, a vast, seemingly infinitely deep chasm in the middle of the ocean, becoming more and more unknowable with each layer that protagonists Riko, Reg, and Anichi pass. Almost every single aspect of the story comes back to the abyss. The mystery of what Reg is tied to the mystery of the abyss. Liza's purpose as the catalyst to start the descent is tied to the abyss. The intertwined stories of Nanachi and Bondrewd wouldn't have happened if not for Bondrewd's desire to understand the abyss. Riko's entire motivation, while seemingly starting off as a quest to find her mother, is eventually admitted by the girl herself to just be a longing to explore the abyss. The abyss is what starts the plot, and it is what continues to drive it. Bolstered by lavish artwork and beautiful music, the series, despite having an extremely simple and loose plot on paper, manages to pull us in the same way it does the characters. The abyss. By exploiting basic human curiosity, the only thing the abyss needs to do to drag us in is exist. Shifting further towards extremity, we find ourselves staring at Tsutomu Nihei's Blame. What do you mean? It's pronounced blam? Blam? Shifting further towards extremity, we find ourselves staring at Tsutomu Nihei's Blam. Jesus Christ. Whereas Made in Abyss is character and world-driven, I'd call Blam story and world-driven, if that. A post-apocalyptic cyberpunk, Blam follows the mysterious and, more often than not, silent Killy as he wanders the infinitely expanding city. Killy himself is basically a blank slate, and not the self-insert kind of blank slate, I mean he literally has the personality of an iron, and most other recurring characters, while often being far more expressive and dynamic, aren't expanded upon or explored much either. The few characters that are, more often than not, either die or just leave the story within a volume. And that story can be quite bare bones at times, especially in the early parts, which is why I hesitate somewhat to call it a story and world-driven plot, mostly consisting of a mess of sci-fi jargon and Killy stumbling around shooting robots in an aimless quest for a net terminal gene. Though when Cybo makes her entrance, the story does become somewhat more focused in the back half. Rather, what makes Blam captivating for me, especially in the early volumes, isn't Killy or his quest, it's the world that he wanders through. The city, despite its nondescript name, is probably one of my favourite cyberpunk settings. A single connected structure, split into countless floors, haphazardly added onto by builders with no sense of purpose or direction, having grown to a ridiculous size, hinted to be larger than that of Jupiter's planetary orbit. Any remaining civilization is limited to a few scattered tribes and settlements, none of whom are anywhere near approaching the level of sophistication of their ancestors. As Killy tramps through a world of murderous AI and towering, nonsensical structures, entire pages go by without a single line of dialogue being spoken. After a while, I found myself with this odd melancholia. Not quite sadness, but a sort of pensive, almost mournful sense of wonderment. The only thing I can really compare it to is walking through an old church, library or castle, or maybe even a cemetery. There's this vague feeling of sadness at seeing such dilapidation, but there's also this feeling of awe, like, even after thousands of years, you can still get a sense for the power this place once held, and in some ways still does hold. A sense that acts like an anchor, pulling me deeper into the city, and though I know I'll never see it all, that does nothing to stop my reverence. But so far we've talked solely about fusions. What about a true plot solely driven by its world? And to that I say it's almost impossible to get a pure X-driven story in traditional media, arguably even more so with world-driven ones, unless you count Andy Warhol's Empire. But it's here where we finally introduce a new, more recent medium that, more so than any other, has the power to create true, world-driven experiences. One could arguably say that a lot of early 8-bit games were world-driven. Often story and characters were condensed into a manual and maybe a few cutscenes or lines of text. Of course, with games, you also have the additional gameplay-driven moniker, which I won't be getting into now. And besides, it's only really within the last 2 decades or so that games have really started to grasp the potential of their medium when it comes to creating experiences driven by their world and nothing else. When looking at games, one can find many examples to choose from. The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild is probably one of the more recent ones, and is a game lauded for its open world design, with the player given a famous amount of freedom to progress the, on paper at least, short and simple story as they see fit. Most of the playtime is going to be spent exploring this vast, forgotten world. You're given objectives to do. You could technically go straight to the final boss and beat the game in less than an hour. But the heart of this game is in the landscapes you climb, the NPCs you meet, the towns you wander into, the enemies you crash in on. The name of the game itself is chosen because of the land of Hyrule, and the act of exploring it was so integral to the game's design, more so than any character or MacGuffin. Going even further, we have Inside, a much shorter, less open game for sure, but one that places the focus even harder on the world than Breath of the Wild. You control a nameless, faceless boy with no backstory given. Control is just handed to you at some point in his story, one you aren't made privy to. With no dialogue or true cutscenes, the only way to figure out anything in this world is to explore it, solve puzzles, and rely on the environment you traverse to give you clues needed to piece everything together. There are plenty of other games I could go through, some of which I might even make separate videos about, like Shadow of the Colossus or Xenoblade Chronicles X, but for brevity's sake, I'm going to skip to the absolute extreme, what I consider an example of a true world-driven game. No characters, no story, just the player and the world. Manifold Garden is a game unlike any other I've played. Without a doubt, the first truly world-driven game I've ever picked up. In the game, you wander around solving puzzles to progress through a world pulled straight out of one of Giovanni Piranesi's prisons. There are no characters in Manifold Garden, and although the sound of your footsteps confirms that you aren't some disembodied camera, for all intents and purposes, you might as well be. There is no story, no prompt to entice you or motivate you to explore the world. You just do, because it exists. A self-perpetuating motivation to uncover and understand more of the mind-bending space you find yourself in, falling from puzzle to puzzle in what the game's developer called a metaphor for the last 400 years of discoveries in physics. There's an odd beauty in that simplicity, and I can't give William Cheer Studio enough credit for managing to capture the same sense of discovery and whimsy that must have grasped our greatest minds all those years ago. If you want to hear more about Manifold Garden's world design, I'd recommend Jacob Geller's video, The Shape of Infinity, where he talks about this game, amongst other things. It's what inspired me to play the game myself and include it in this video, so go check it out if you're interested to hear more. I've linked it in the description below. To try and come to some kind of conclusion here, world-driven games, especially when done right, evoke this fantastic tranquility for me, where time just stops and I'm suddenly given this unlimited freedom, this power to explore this unknown land at my pleasure. I almost want to call it slice of life, if that even makes sense. It's hard to explain, but Breath of the Wild, Manifold Garden, Shadow of the Colossus, they all work to drag me out of my mind, force me to forget about past mistakes, future worries. They bring me to the present, make me focus on what I can do now, slow me down, take in the beauty of what I might have missed. It's a mindset that I'm thankful to be able to translate over to the real world. I want to lose myself in the scenery, in exploration, to dive in, not knowing if I'll ever come back up, and being completely at ease with that, if only for a few minutes.